Welcome back from the break. We hope that the first sessions were thought-provoking and that the discussions were interesting. We will now move on to the panel focusing on the European Union's challenges and outlooks for cybersecurity, moderated by Jan Wünsche, strategy researcher at the CCDCOE.
And just like before, we encourage you to present questions to our panelists through the chat function and to share your thoughts on social media by using the hashtag CyCon 2021. But without further ado, Jan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henrik and Lena. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation on EU cybersecurity policy and its impact globally. I would like to say first that this discussion is not meant to be only between me and the members of our distinguished panel. So don't forget that you can submit your questions in the chat function on your screen, and I will get those questions. I will post them to our panelists, and I will do that towards the end of this session. And we'll promise to try to cover as many of them as possible. The EU member states have had to deal with an onslaught of adversarial cyber activity for a number of years. And sadly, it has far from subsided during the last year and a half, while we've also had to deal with the global COVID-19 pandemic. There's been both criminal and state-sponsored activities, and they have continued with a number of substantial attacks against the healthcare sector and also against politicians and parliaments. But at the same time, the EU has also been active in developing policies, regulations, and defensive frameworks, and in promoting norms for responsible state behavior. Last year, we saw EU imposing its first ever sanctions against cyber attacks, and in December, EU's Cybersecurity Strategy for the digital decade was presented. I'm thrilled to have with me a panel that I'm sure will have interesting takes on these topics. So with me, I have Evangelos Zouzounis, the head of ENISA's Policy Development and Implementation Unit. ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, is at the center of implementing some of the policies that we're going to be discussing today. Welcome. Next, we have Paul Jonsson, Swedish Member of Parliament and the Chairman of the Swedish Parliament's Committee on Defence. So he's very much involved in the policy making in one of the EU member states. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
And finally, Manon Leblanc, head of cyber sector at the European External Action Service, EEAS, and one of the authors of the new Cybersecurity Strategy for EU. Welcome, Manon.
Thank you.
So I would like to start by taking something from that strategy as the starting point for our discussion. And early on in that strategy, there's a headline which talks about the idea of thinking global and acting European. So I want to ask you all what that means to you. And I'd like to start with you, Manon. And since you have been involved in actually writing this strategy and formulating it, I hope you can also say something on how this idea is reflected in the strategy. So, Manon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you so much for having me on this distinguished event. It's really an honor to speak here today, and unfortunately not in person, but from my study here, I'm happy to exchange views with you, and I hope that some questions will be raised after so we can really exchange on some of these issues. So first of all, thinking global, acting European. As we all know, the EU has a strategy of advancing an open, stable, and secure cyberspace, which is global, which is interoperable. But at the same time, there is also a need for the EU to protect itself and to really strengthen, in that sense, its own sovereignty and autonomy. And there has been a lot of discussion about what this exactly means. And there's some different interpretations there, but I think it's very easy to share this concept and see it as a way of Europeans to take charge, in that sense, of themselves in an increasingly harsh world. And that is something that we have been doing for years, and a concept that we have been developing actually since 2016 already, and we're deepening that concept in that sense of the union as a political union and as a global player. And that has also been announced by the Commission as a geopolitical commission in that sense. It does not mean that we are not fostering our traditional alliances and our traditional partnerships. However, we also acknowledge that in the long term, the EU has to increasingly take charge of its own protection and our own security to defend our interests and values in what is really becoming a more harsher and complex environment. And the cybersecurity within that structure is really a key component, both of the Europe's digital future, of its recovery plan, as well as of its security union strategy, and of course its global strategy for that matter. It's really there to bolster the EU's resilience against cyber threats on one hand, but on the other hand also to advance this global, open, stable, and secure cyberspace, and to really have this full spectrum, whole of government approach when it comes to cybersecurity. And the cybersecurity strategy there is also in three main pillars. One that is aimed at increasing our resilience and increasing our technological sovereignty and our leadership in cyberspace, where the Commission has put forward several strands to reform, for instance, the rules on security of network and information systems under the NIS Directive, as we all know it as NIS 2, but also to increase the level of specifically critical public and private sectors, as well as increase awareness and capacities of the workforce, as well as of small and medium businesses. So among the full spectrum, from the user to private sector to the critical infrastructure, as well as governments, really trying to boost this resilience as one of the core elements of the EU cybersecurity strategy, and also using instruments such as security operation centers across the EU, using new technologies to really make sure that we are able to offer that protection to all businesses, citizens, and governments in the EU. We further build on that by also building further operational capacity to prevent, deter, and respond to malicious cyber activities, using all the instruments and all the pillars and the communities that we have within the EU. And first of all, we have launched there, the Commission and the High Representative, in the strategy, a proposal to establish a joint cyber unit, which has taken the lead by the Commission, but certainly the High Representative is also contributing to this, as we see a merit in really having all those communities work together in making sure that we are able to protect ourselves as Europeans, and at the same time protect also this global, open, stable, and secure cyberspace. And there we see also development with each of these communities, and under the High Representative, that means a development of the cyber diplomacy community, on one hand really promoting responsible behavior, promoting this global and open cyberspace, as well as protecting it by using diplomatic means. And you already have referred to the first time that the European Union has imposed restrictive measures to individuals and entities that were responsible for or involved in cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks against the Union. And the same we have done also in October when we imposed further restrictive measures to such actors. That said, we really see the merit in really taking this approach from an international perspective, the need to really advance this global and open cyberspace, to really prevent such behavior in the first place by having this resilience, by having the ability to use also these diplomatic measures to counter, but foremost also by promoting the EU's vision of cyberspace. And in that regard, we have built this third pillar of the cybersecurity strategy around the fact that we have a certain vision of cyberspace being global, thinking global, but at the same time also promoting this European Union values of human rights, fundamental freedoms, respect for the rule of law, and translating those in international norms and standards, really advancing those to make sure that everyone can reap the benefits of it. So we see that on the standardization side, on the fact of how criminal behavior is countered, how we promote responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and how we promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, we have put forward the vision there from the European perspective, which is universalized within numerous United Nations documents, as well as on which we cooperate with partners. And then to say, okay, we need to also strengthen our partnerships, both with public entities, with other countries, with international organizations, as well as with the private sector in this regard, and also help other countries to meaningfully participate by not only helping them in capacity building to counter cyber threats or to tackle cyber crime, but also to see if we can support them to really participate in these global debates on these issues, such as responsible state behavior or countering criminal behavior. And for that, we really see the link between the EU as a player, as a strong global player, in this global debate on cyber security and cyber crime. So I think from my side, that's my initial contribution. But again, I look very much forward to the further exchange that we will have today. Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank you very much, Manon. It's really good to hear you speak about protecting those European values, not making this just a technical issue, and also to hear. You describe EU as a global power, and I hope we'll use that to the best effect. Evangelos, you're up next. What does thinking global, acting European mean to you? And can you say a little about how that can be seen in ENISA's work?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today in this very nice event. And as you know, ENISA is quite active in the area of cybersecurity policy development and implementation. And in my opinion, this EU cybersecurity strategy is probably one of the most elaborated documents outlining many important actions, and I think we all can be very proud of these initiatives and all these proposals. I will start with this. So it's a great piece of work, which demonstrates, in my opinion, as well, the maturity that we have reached as a European Union, as member states, as EU organizations as well. Now, when it comes to the phenomenon, we all know that cybersecurity is a global phenomenon. We know very well that there are no borders, and attacks, can be launched for everywhere. And we have personal experience, all of us, from this. And for that reason, our efforts should be global. And it's important, to see all dimensions, also the international aspects, and to understand the phenomenon and the characteristics of it from a global perspective. However, to see very tangible results, we have to focus, and we have to focus on our characteristics, on our specificities, on the things that we have as Europeans. And there are a lot of things that we are very good at on cybersecurity. So first of all, we have an agency like ENISA who operates for many years, and there are other sister agencies, organizations, with growing knowledge and expertise on this in this field. So very well EC3 and other bodies. And in my opinion, this knowledge and this expertise, can help. Also, we have seen the member states are developing a lot of capabilities, a lot of expertise a lot of knowledge. They all have now a cybersecurity strategy, and the NIS Directive also paved the way for a common level playing field, I can use the term. Not all countries are of the same level of maturity, but in my opinion, they are almost all above a certain baseline. All the private sector as well in Europe was always very good on cybersecurity. We have a few important cybersecurity players, in European players, and there are some areas where we are still scoring quite high in terms of innovation, products, and so on. So this means that Europe is a big global player, on cybersecurity, and this strategy comes actually on time to reinforce exactly this and say, we are here, we are Europeans, we take ownership, we are accountable for this, and we have our own strategy, and this strategy basically covers all these aspects that Manon already outlined. And in my opinion, this is important, as Europe, as a continent, to position itself vis-a-vis the other global players and strike for a certain understanding or even collaboration, cooperation in some cases. Now, when it comes to ENISA, the agency is quite known for developing good practices in several areas. My unit and myself are for many, many years, helping the member states in implementing policies. So we have, for example, assisted the Commission and the member states in implementing the NIS Directive, EIDAS, in the past the telecom framework, the incident reporting notification, but also recently with the modernization, let's say, of ENISA with the new mandate, the CSA, we got responsibilities to deal with certification. We are building up, our operational capacity, and we are assisting now operational entities in Europe, for example, through the CSET network. And we have a very important team that deals with capacity building. For many, many years, we have delivered, exercises like Cyber Europe. We offer trainings to institutions like CSERTs and so on. And of course, there is some work done already on awareness raising and other related activities. So the agency is becoming a reference, in this area. And the strategy actually highlights a lot the importance of ENISA and highlights also areas where ENISA can play a role. Like, for example, 5G, where we have already contributed a lot. We have developed a toolkit together with the member states and the Commission. We have definitely played an important role in the NIS Directive, and we somehow are going to play an important role as well, in these aspects, in these areas in the future. The only way to improve cybersecurity is to act local. You have to engage the players. You have to engage the stakeholders. This is where the trust is. This is where, the capacity is. And as I said, in Europe, we don't have one, let's say, level of maturity. There are different levels of maturity. So that's why we have to continue working. And this strategy is a very important document, but it's not the end of this trip. It's an important milestone. We will definitely remember this, but still a lot of things need to be done, and the strategy outlines them. Operational cooperation, the joint cyber unit, further actions, on 5G, the NIS Directive, but also other cybersecurity-related actions like the artificial intelligence regulation, the upcoming EIDAS, work that has some flavor on cybersecurity, CR, also, and DORA, and other related activities which are, more sectorial. Next year, maybe the electricity code, network code for the energy sector. So these are all signs that we as a society are becoming better, and we act together, and we join forces, to achieve better security for Europe. And in my opinion, the document that the cybersecurity strategy is basically demonstrates this, highlights this understanding and this maturity. So we can all be very proud, of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Vangelis. And you mentioned ENISA as a reference, so I hope you can be proud of that as a reference for others as well. Paul, get to you last. So what's your take on this? And maybe you can comment something also on how you combine acting European with acting nationally as you have to do.
Absolutely, John. I'd be delighted to. Let me also say thank you very much to CyCon for having me on this terrific panel. As a politician and as a defense generalist, I feel terribly outgunned when it comes to expertise into cybersecurity. I just want to have that disclaimer. I just also want to say that since I belong to the opposition, I don't speak on behalf of the Swedish government. Just a few reflections then, John, on the question you posed about thinking global but acting European. What does it really mean? Well, in essence, to my mind, it should mean that the EU will be a force for good in the digital world, both for its own citizens and for others. And just as Manon alluded to, we are, of course, exposed now to a much more intensive great power competition. And I think there is a very strong correlation between stability in the cyber domain and stability in international politics. I also know there's a lot of talks these days about enhancing and strengthening EU strategic autonomy. I think it's reasonable that Europe take a more responsibility also for its own security in the cyber domain. At the same time, I would caution against any kind of protectionism or isolationist tendencies, because when it comes to the cyber domain, I also think that we need to work much more extensively with other like-minded liberal democracies in general. And I think also it's very important that we actually strengthen transatlantic cooperation when it comes to cyber and digitalization. Therefore, I strongly also welcome the initiative of having this transatlantic technology and trade council, even though I realize it's going to be a tall order of issues that such a council would have to discuss and elaborate on. Also, John, since you said I do not represent any EU institution, I thought I could take a little bit of a national perspective on EU cooperation in cyber and try to make 3 points. First, stating the obvious, of course, EU cooperation is not the only game in town when it comes to cybersecurity. It is, of course, first and foremost a national responsibility to ensure a high level of cybersecurity. This is an issue that is strongly entangled into vital national security interest and also increasingly into the economic competitiveness of the member states. Thus, I think sovereignty and national security issues is going to shape also the conditions where the EU will be operating in the future when it comes to cyber security. In addition, I also want to point out that Sweden not only cooperate on an EU level, we also cooperate quite extensively among the other Nordic countries on cybersecurities. And I think there is quite strong reasons for that. All the Nordic countries are exposed to a similar threat landscape. We have reached about the same level of maturity when it comes to digitalization. And most of all, a lot of our digital infrastructure is such as telecom, banking, and financial services are strongly intertwined and connected. Thus, our CERT teams do joint exercises, as does our government authorities. As you also might know, the Nordic prime ministers actually stated the vision that the Nordic region should be the most integrated 5G region in the world in the future. Now, I'm not saying there's a competition between Nordic cooperation and EU cooperation, since we're working on the same standards that actually the EU provide in this area. But I'm saying that among all the 27, I think in the future, just as in defense cooperations, I think you will find islands of deeper cooperation among certain member states, but all based on the kind of standards that the EU provides. Second point, this said, the EU has indeed provided us and other member states with very helpful tools. We talked before about the NIS Directive. Before Sweden joined the NIS agreement, then we actually did not have a national cybersecurity strategy. We did not have mandatory incidenting reporting, and I think that the NIS directive actually provided a useful sector system for critical information security and in critical infrastructure. So indeed, the EU has helped us advance our own cybersecurity. Same goes for the EU Toolbox on 5G, I think been helpful. Third point then, what I would ask from the EU maybe is better coordination. Sometimes when you're sitting in the national capitals, it feels like an avalanche of different initiatives that come to you, both in relations to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. Here I would welcome a closer coordination, for example, between ENISA and Europol EC3. I would welcome a strong coordination between the PESCO projects, the EDF projects, and Horizon on cybersecurity. I think it's kind of important also that when we're working with the strategic compass, that we actually think informally, well informed about the EU's cybersecurity strategy, especially when we're dealing with the basket of resilience. And of course, stating the obvious here, but stronger EU-NATO cooperation, I think also is vital. And of course, we have made a lot of progress on this area since the Wales Summits in 2016, but I would welcome any further measures. But I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. It must be exciting to try to work on all of these levels at the same time. And I'm also happy to hear that the EU is actually a venue where we can drive some of these questions and get them done in the nations. So there is value in this cooperation in that way as well. Before we go on, is there any one of you that would like to make any comments on each other's statements here? I thought I saw Manon at least smiling at some comments. So
no. I was smiling indeed at the comment also on strategic autonomy and the cooperation with partners, because on one hand, I already, when I started my talk, noted it that this is a concept which is often misunderstood and which should by no means be understood as a lack of cooperation with other partners. And indeed, I really underline that, especially on cybersecurity, there is a need for us to really have this cooperation, have close transatlantic cooperation, as well as like-minded cooperation. And that is something that we see both when it comes to promoting responsible behavior, when having this coordination, setting the standards, setting international norms of behavior. Currently, we are, for instance, in the UN negotiations on in the third committee on countering criminal behavior, and next week we have the organizational meeting of the next open-ended working group. We are jointly promoting also the program of action to advance responsible state behavior with over 53 partners around the world, trying to create a permanent platform for member states, UN member states in the UN, to have this cooperation and really implement some of the things that we have been able to agree over the last years. But also when it comes to cooperation on the cyber diplomacy toolbox and the diplomatic responses in that regard, where on numerous occasions we have had coordinated responses, most recently when it comes to the reaction to the SolarWind cyber operation, but also again referring back to the cyber sanctions that we put out over in July, where we had around 10 partners very vocal on supporting the EU, applauding the EU on that decision to really advance responsible state behavior and to really influence the behavior thereof with imposing those sanctions. So there is a lot of cooperation. Another example, last week we organized as EU an exercise with 11 international partners plus all EU member states on diplomatic engagement in cyberspace. So I can only underline the importance of it. At the same time, I also underline the need for the EU to really protect itself, protect its citizens and its businesses from cyber threats. And therefore, I think that especially thinking global, acting European fits very well together. So thank you, Jan, for spotting my smile and letting me play.
Okay, I think we should move on. And my first question is actually related to those sanctions. One of the tools in the EU's cyber diplomacy toolbox. And EU imposed sanctions or restrictive measures on both individuals and entities in Russia and China in response to some of the most prominent cyber attacks in recent years, including WannaCry, NotPetya, CloudHopper, and eventually also the hacks against the German Bundestag. So these are attacks going back all the way to 2015. And it's, of course, a quite clear signal to those responsible for those attacks. But is it effective? And these sanctions are not implying any official attribution of the attacks to a state. Would nations jointly attributing attacks help make a bigger impact than we get from this? Manon, would you care to continue?
No, definitely, no problem. And I think the cyber sanctions regime, the autonomous horizontal cyber sanctions regime of the EU, which only exists since 2019, so that it hasn't dealt with more recent attacks, also has to do with the fact that it's only established in 2019. It's part of a wider cyber diplomacy effort of the EU, and it really merits for us to really go back a bit of where this sanctions regime is part of this cyber diplomacy toolbox, which is there to really encourage cooperation, mitigate cyber threats, and influence behavior, to see if we can have actors refrain in the end from undertaking such behavior, but also to establish a certain normative framework by pointing out behavior that we find unacceptable. And this cyber diplomacy toolbox, which is part of our wider cyber diplomacy policy, is there to prevent, deter, and respond to malicious behavior in cyberspace, using the full range of measures that we have at our disposal. And restrictive measures is just one of these tools that we have. And we also don't see this tool necessarily, nor any other tool, nor the ability of the EU or member states to attribute malicious cyber activities in a vacuum. We see this as part of a longer-term strategy where we can have a sustained effort over time to counter malicious behavior in cyberspace. And the horizontal cyber sanctions regime, which indeed addresses individuals and entities, so it's very focused. It has a specific legal scope to it, so it addresses individuals and entities involved in cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks with a significant effect to the Union or its member states, is part of that effort, is part of that Union toolbox, so to say, to promote our CFSP objectives that include peace, democracy, respect of the rule of law, human rights, but also that is aimed to really prevent conflicts in cyberspace. And it's not there to punish necessarily or to retaliate, but it's there to bring a change in policy or activity by the targeted countries or the entities or the individuals in case of the horizontal cyber sanctions regime. And these measures are very targeted, but they are not the only measures that we are using. We're using also public communication measures. We're using measures such as private demarches, as efforts that we do in the OSCE when it comes to confidence building measures. So we're not only using sanctions or restrictive measures in that sense to influence that behavior, but we're using this full package to send messages, to shape expectations regarding malicious cyber activities that will not be tolerated by us, and to build also international consensus around that normative framework and around the need to really advance security and stability by respecting the rule of law, by applying international law in cyberspace, by adhering by these norms of responsible state behavior. And through that, the restrictive measures, the sanctions regime can contribute to deterring malicious actors from undertaking these activities, and also to show that we do not accept this, that we show solidarity with the victims, that we show the solidarity with our allies, and that we push back on this malicious behavior. So in that sense, it is not a tool which is standing on its own. It's part of a package. It's part of a longer-term strategy to really have a sustained effort countering back. And with the cybersecurity strategy, to pick back on what we have been discussing before, we have put out proposals that would even strengthen not only the cyber sanctions regime in that regard, but the whole approach by really strengthening our shared situational awareness, strengthening our deterrence posture or our posture in cyberspace to push back on such malicious behavior in cyberspace, and at the same time also strengthening our cooperation both with partners within the EU, for instance, through the Joint Cyber Unit, which is to be established, but also with international partners in that regard. And through that package, we hope and we are determined in that sense to push back on this behavior, making sure that everyone can reap the benefits of cyberspace and the internet. So I know there's always a discussion about sanctions and are they effective and are they working, but they really need to be seen as a part of a broader effort by the EU as well as by our partners.
Okay, thank you. Paul, what is your take on this?
Now, quite similar. I mean, if you're aiming for altering immediate behavior, you're going to be up for a disappointment, of course, but that's the same logic that goes with sanctions in general, that it's difficult to achieve your goals very, very quickly. Are they quick enough, these sanctions? No, probably not. On the other side, we also know that other sanctions and restrictive measures, the EU has unfortunately been slow on its feet, to my mind. For example, vis-a-vis Belarus, I think we have the similar challenge there. Then joint attribution and coordinated attribution, I would welcome it. I think it would be very effective as a strong statement, but we all know the challenges, and that is that the member states don't always feel comfortable sharing intelligence among each others because they want to not reveal their sources. And I think this is a fact that we're going to be living with for some time. So even though it would be desirable, I think it's kind of a little bit in the too hard to do box yet. But let me say, I also strongly welcome the EU diplomatic toolbox as an initiative, and I think it's a way for the EU also to be better prepared and for having good responses also into the digital domain.
Thank you very much. Evangelos, do you have a comment on this topic?
Yes. I mean, as you know, NIS is not an operational agency, so in that respect, we don't deal with attribution and is not within our mandate. But definitely there are organizations, within member states and at the EU level that are somehow dealing with this matter. In my opinion, this is an important component of a sanction. You need to have some evidence, and to build up and this evidence is so that's the first thing. And I think Europe is getting better, at building up the evidences and developing its capabilities with regards to attribution. And yes, there are difficulties in collaboration at operational level and sharing information. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky, but this is getting also a little bit better. So in that respect, I think the procedure, the mechanism, for attributing attacks will be better and better and better in the future. So overall, as soon as you have the facts and you can say, using some common sense, some logic, some forensics, from where the attack is coming from, then you need to demonstrate, all the things that Manon said very nicely. So you cannot just sit expecting to be attacked without responding, And I think the most educated, the most diplomatic approach is the sanctions, which are not meant to punish, but mostly to educate, to explain what is an acceptable behavior and what is not.
Yeah.
And yes, there are some, and there Europe is getting better. We have, all the diplomatic, experience from other areas, from other, let's say, experiences that we can definitely use. It's a great also, it's quite important to see that ministries of foreign affairs are, getting more familiar with cybersecurity matters, and they take ownership of it. It's also important to see that not only at national level, but at EU level, the topic of cybersecurity is one of the important elements, in discussions with, for example, countries outside of the Union. So as part of important strategic dialogue with them. And again, we have built up this culture. And in my opinion, this is important to show where is the baseline. Now, when it comes to the time, yes, at the EU, bringing all the member states together, discussing, agreeing, might take a little bit time, but Europe is very well known for, taking very calm, very educated, very, risk-based, functional, fact-based decisions. So from one side, we might be sometimes, not always, but sometimes we might be a little bit late in responding, but at the same time, when Europe reacts, then definitely it is factual, it is based on evidence, it is proportionate, and there was enough debate and discussion, among the member states, and nobody feels uncomfortable with this. So things can only get better in this area, and we have already went through a big way forward over the years, and I think the cybersecurity strategy with the diplomatic toolbox and also, the efforts, the Tallinn manual and others, actually paved the way for this. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that that you're right and that this statement will actually influence others and tell them what is acceptable and start building that common agreement on what that is. From this question about response, I'm going to move to a question more about protection, I guess. And the background for that is something that's been in the news and talked about a lot, namely another toolbox, the one for cybersecurity of 5G networks. And behind that toolbox was an EU coordinated risk assessment. And I'm wondering now, will this way of working be applied to other areas in the future? And will we see further toolboxes or improved toolbox for 5G in the future? And will a risk assessment carried out in this way as a coordinated EU effort bring out the right risks and the relevant risks to build those measures on? And I'm going to give this question to you first, Evangelos.
Okay, thank you. So, look, the 5G is an example of Europe taking leadership and acting very quickly. For European standards, that was very, very quick. So within 3 months, there was a recommendation. Then after the recommendation, the member states had 3 months to respond with a national risk assessment. The member states issued a consolidated risk assessment early October, and the toolbox, was proposed already in January. So in less than a year, from a recommendation to something very specific, very tangible, like the toolbox, was actually phenomenal. And I can tell you that all continents actually were very much impressed because Europe, as I explained before, took a very scientific, a very factual, a very risk-based approach. So, and that was quite good, in my opinion, because we went down to the technical and the strategic, measures. We have identified technical strategic risks. We have given, a repertoire tools, that member states can use without restricting their freedom. And they had, an opportunity to mix the tools in the best possible way and even, add additional tools. So this flexibility, in my opinion, was necessary to deal with a topic like 5G. And this shows that in difficult topics like 5G, for example, there is a beauty in it. And the end result was basically independent of vendors, independent of technologies, was independent also of states or countries. That's quite significant, and I believe that that's the way to go on similar topics. And it was very phenomenal to see as well that all countries united forces, and they all contributed. They took ownership of it. So just to tell you that a few countries have acted as chairs of this initiative, and there were several countries actually candidating, to be the chairs and co-chairs of this initiative. And at the end of the day, they all took ownership. We had several meetings, and they worked very hard. It's not very obvious and this shows. I believe that in the future we might have, an update of the toolbox, not very soon, but maybe in the coming years. And definitely there might be situations like 5G where we might have to respond in a similar way. I cannot give you a concrete example because that might be maybe inappropriate, but I think that the policymakers in Brussels, the member states themselves, they have very good experiences of this methodology, and they have slightly used this, for the mobile tracing apps, that have been developed last year. They have developed a toolbox again. It was not exactly like the 5G, but it was at the footsteps of this initiative. So in the future, we might see more consolidated risk assessments and toolboxes like the one that we did with the member states before. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, perhaps you have some comment on how has this helped Sweden in tackling this question, and do you see other questions where it could be helpful with the same approach?
I touched on it very briefly in my introductory remarks, and I think that the way the toolbox played out on 5G it was very helpful. I think that also the fact that you alluded to before that the member states actually took ownership of it made it helpful as well. Also, could it be used in other areas? I think so. If we could make it some more generic or technology neutral, if I may use that expression. I think this was something that was very well appreciated in Sweden with this 5G toolbox. Let me also say that we rather quickly in Sweden adopted new national legislation as well in regarding to auctioning out on the 5G net as well. So we acted also in a concert effort back in Sweden. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and then that legislation has been challenged, one might say, right now. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. Manon, your answer to this question.
Well, indeed, I can only repeat, I guess, what colleagues have said, and especially supply chain attacks have become very frequent, and with the increased relevance also of those supply chains for our strategic autonomy, we really need to step up also in this regard. And I think that also the NIS Directive, the new proposal, also envisages the possibility for the NIS Cooperation Group, the mechanism that really discusses this, to conduct such coordinated risk assessment of critical supply chain, following the approach taken with 5G, considering all factors in this assessment. And we really see this possibility of conducting such risk assessments as an interesting instrument for the Commission to use, as well as for member states to use. I think the 5G toolbox in that regard has been a very good achievement and has produced results for the EU, where member states' authorities have pooled their expertise and have been able to agree on a joint analysis of risks. And this is certainly an instrument that member states can look into in the future as well, to really make sure that those critical supply chains and those critical technologies are protected in that regard. So there's really a value in this.
Thank you. I can see that we have quite a few questions, and now they disappeared from my screen, actually, from the audience. So I'm going to pick a couple of them where we don't have all that much time left. But the first one, through what measures is the EEAS going to organize a common opinion of the Union regarding how the international law applies to cyberspace? Will you publish a common position paper, and how do you balance between differences of member states? For example, France and Germany, and this is very much a question to Manon, of course.
Indeed. Well, I mean, balancing positions of EU member states is our daily job, so that's what we do. That's what I do. to start off with that. So this is not necessarily something in itself which is new, but indeed the EU is not a player as such when it comes to international law. We are no state in that regard, to underline, but I think we have an interest in advancing the understanding of the application of international law. We also promoted this internationally. So through these discussions among member states, we hope to encourage and evolve the thinking within the European Union as well as within member states on the application of international law. That will not only help us to really promote that and promote responsible state behavior in cyberspace, but as well as help us in our diplomatic approaches to counter behavior that is contrary to that. And we see that, for instance, with the interpretation that we have on due diligence, since we have established that interpretation, it is easier for us to use also that instrument in our diplomatic engagement. And there, I think that we have instruments in place. We have expertise, notably within member states, colleagues who have been working on this issue for quite some time and who can contribute to that. We've also had already discussions in Council, in, for instance, the legal working group, on this issue. And we are also looking forward to having these discussions among member states in the Cyber Working Party, not necessarily with an aim to go as fast as possible towards an EU position on the application of international law, but again, to stimulate thinking and to help also evolve the EU and its member states in their thinking on how international law applies in cyberspace, as we do promote that also internationally. For instance, in our contributions to the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, as well as to the informal consultations of the GGE. So,
okay,
good faith.
Yeah, thank you for that. The next question is for Evangelos. Where are the strong and where are the weak points in cyber defense cooperation across countries in Europe from an NISA point of view then?
Yes, well, member states collaborate very nicely when it comes, to policy making. They have developed the culture with the NIS Directive and also other related policy initiatives. They have, the council. They have, a lot of them have now detached, seconded experts, in their embassies in Brussels, and they contribute quite nicely on this. So this, in my opinion, worked quite nicely. And I see a growing maturity also when it comes to cooperation on operational matters. So there are, islands of cooperation within the Union which are stronger than others, but the sister network is getting also up to speed, and they are sharing more and more. And the NIS Cooperation Group helped as well, to develop this kind of understanding at a tactical or strategic level. So this is getting quite nicely. Of course, there is still the level of trust is not there, not with everybody, not in all cases. So we still need to build it up. But judging, from the last 3-4 years with the 5G, with the NIS Directive and other instruments, we are getting better. But I still believe that we can do better on operational matters, especially when it comes to crisis. That's why, we are now developing CyCon. We are developing lots of exercises which are simulating such kind of phenomena. I'm not so sure that we have the SOPs, the standard operating procedures in place, to deal with crises like this in the future, especially big crises. There we can become better. One thing that is quite important is the role of the private sector. I mean, at national level, public and private sector collaborate very nicely. And however, at the European level, the role of the private sector, especially big multinationals, European companies who are active in several countries, I don't know how well they are integrated into the ecosystem. We, as NISA, have built up several ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers, to collect, experiences, threats, and so on. But I would definitely like to see a better public-private cooperation at the EU level as well as at national level, and also with the member states having an important role. The attribution part is getting better. We have discussed this. I'm not expert, and NISA is not expert on the matter, but we see this getting better, and I see better efforts also on diplomatic efforts. These are all, interrelated aspects that we all have to understand. And if we become better in one, we need to become better in others so that the end result is getting better. I think that Europe is getting a brand, getting a name, a reputation for cybersecurity. And because of its complexity with so many member states, it is considered as a microcosm of the cybersecurity complexity at global level. And if they see us managing this complexity for 27 countries, they have big reassurances that Europe can deal with the global phenomenon, and its global players. And this is very reassuring, I think, for the future. And don't forget that the cybersecurity strategy is an important milestone towards this direction.
Okay, thank you. We still have a lot of questions. I won't be able to get to them all. I want to get to my own last question before we close. And I think you will have to give quite brief answers to this one so we don't run over our time. From what I've heard today, I think you all agree that it's important for EU and its member states to try to advance responsible state behavior in cyberspace. What is the single most important thing that EU can do to achieve that? And I would like to give that question to Paul first.
Thank you very much. It struck me, just if I could take one more thing, is that we talked a lot
Absolutely.
about regulation, and the EU is quite focused on that. I know also they're trying to stimulate, of course, innovation, but I think that's very, very important for the future for the year as well, and also to build on the strengths that we have, such as 5G and entering into 6G, and devote a lot of attention and resources to innovation. That being said, how do we shape responsible behavior? Manon talked before about the UN process. I think that's important, but I don't expect anything to happen very rapidly. As I said also in my introductory remarks, I think it's very important that the EU work with other liberal democracies and in particularly focusing maybe on strengthening the transatlantic dialogue on these matters as well. I think that's there is much room for improvement for creating a stronger common vision of establishing a safe and open cyberspace.
That's very good. Evangelos.
Yeah, look, I would suggest, Europe to stick to the basic principles, so use science, be factual, develop solutions based on momentum, and use its diplomatic, experience, and use the values, the European values, as a basis to demonstrate to the world that we are a very responsible partner, and we expect from others, to behave in a responsible manner. Thank you.
Thank you. And last out then, Manon, what's your single most important thing to do?
Single most important thing to do? Well, I think we need to show responsible behavior, we need to promote responsible behavior, and we need to enforce it in that sense. And we do show it really by having this strategy and for instance, doing all this work on making sure that we are secure on our due diligence obligation in that regard. We are promoting responsible behavior, including by also putting forward proposals in the United Nations to really actively work on this, work on the implementation of, through, for instance, the program of action that we put forward together with 53 other states. But we're also enforcing it there to really show what is responsible behavior in cyberspace and what is it not, and to then also use diplomatic measures to influence actors towards that responsible behavior. So for me, it's not one thing, it's three. We need to show it, we need to promote it, and we need to enforce it.
Okay, but showing it by doing the right thing, I think that's a nice last point. Thank you so much to the panel for being part of CyCon. It's been a real pleasure discussing this with you. And thank you also to the audience for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't cover them all. And for your attention. And with that, I will leave the word back to our hosts. Thank you.